After 50 years in the home, my late husband and I built our lives, and my own son stood in my kitchen and told me I should find a place more suitable for my age. He didn't see the way my hand tightened around the coffee cup, or the memories that flashed through my mind. Birthdays, under the old trellis, quiet evenings in the rose garden we planted together. I didn't argue. I smiled, nodded, and quietly put the house up for sale without telling him. 2 weeks later, while he was standing over my kitchen table holding the contract that gave him 14 days to leave, I was already thousands of miles away, feeling the sea breeze on my face as the sun set over the caldera in Santorini. That was the day I stopped being the guest in my own life. The sun was warm on my shoulders that morning, and the scent of the roses drifted up as I clipped away a few dead blooms. My garden had always been my pride. 50 years of tending to these beds in our quiet corner of Santa Barbara had turned this place into more than a house. It was a part of me. I could see the trellis my late husband John built the year after we were married. I could almost hear the laughter of birthday parties, the hum of neighbors stopping by with pies, the voices of my son Ethan running through the yard as a boy. I knelt down to pull a stubborn weed and brushed dirt from my gloves. That's when I heard the back door close. The sound was brisk, almost sharp. Ethan's voice followed, but it was quieter than usual, and I sensed something was off even before I turned. He was standing just inside the kitchen, his wife Chelsea beside him. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, except for that faint upturn at the corner of her mouth that always made me feel as though she knew something I didn't. "Mom." Ethan began, his tone clipped. "We've been talking, and we think it's time you started looking for a place that's more suitable for you." I straightened slowly, my knees protesting, and looked from him to her. "Suitable?" I repeated, my voice soft but steady. "What do you mean?" Chelsea tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were addressing a child. "Somewhere that's easier to manage at your age. You know, fewer stairs, less yard work. It would be better for everyone." The clippers in my hand felt suddenly heavy. My age. I had spent the past 5 decades keeping this home, raising Ethan here, making sure it was a safe, warm place. Now it was too much for me. Ethan shifted, avoiding my eyes. "We've got plans for the place. With a little remodeling, it could be perfect for us. And you wouldn't have to worry about anything." I stepped onto the porch, the wood warm under my shoes, and met his gaze. "Plans," I said, letting the word hang between us. "And where exactly would I be in those plans?" Chelsea didn't hesitate. "We'd help you find somewhere nice, maybe a retirement community near the beach. They have activities other people your age." I cut her off before she could finish painting her version of my future. "I have activities here, friends here, my life is here." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's just the house is a lot. You deserve to relax." Relax. As though my life's work had become a burden and my presence an inconvenience. I could feel something tightening in my chest, not from hurt alone, but from a dawning clarity. They had already decided what was best for me without asking. Ethan glanced toward the living room, his voice quieter. "It would be easier if you started packing some things now. Just the essentials." The roses swayed in the breeze behind me, their petals bright against the morning light. I thought of every holiday dinner we'd had here, every storm we'd waited out in this very living room. I thought of John's hands calloused from building that porch railing, and how we'd promised each other this would be our forever home. I took a breath, steadying myself. "I see," I said finally. "Well, I'll think about it." Chelsea's smile returned, thin and satisfied. "Good, because I've already been talking to a designer about remodeling once you've settled somewhere else. We could really open this place up, make it modern." Her words washed over me, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Not literally, but in the way everything I'd known here suddenly seemed fragile. The garden, the walls, the memories, they were all mine, but in their eyes they were just space waiting to be repurposed. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak more. My hands were steady as I set the clippers on the porch rail. Inside the house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, and wondered when my home had stopped being mine in their minds. Out in the garden, the roses kept swaying as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. It wasn't always like this. Back in 2018, when Ethan and Chelsea showed up at my doorstep with hopeful smiles and the promise of helping me out, I thought it was a blessing. John had been gone for almost a year, and the evenings felt too long, the silence in the house too loud. Having my son and his family move in seemed like a way to fill those empty spaces. At first it worked. Dinners together, Chelsea bringing home pastries from the cafe she liked, Ethan mowing the lawn on weekends. Emily, their daughter, filled the halls with her chatter, asking me about the old photos on the walls. It felt good to hear the front door open and close, to smell coffee brewing when I came down in the mornings. But slowly, almost without noticing, I began to feel my home shifting under me. It started with the living room rug. One morning it was gone, replaced with something more modern Chelsea had found on sale. Then it was the dining table John built. She said the legs were wobbly, but I'd eaten at that table for 40 years without a problem. It was replaced by a sleek glass thing that never seemed to fit the warmth of the room. The walls began to change too. My framed photos. John holding a fish at the lake, Ethan as a boy in his Little League uniform, my parents on their wedding day, were taken down to make space for abstract prints in muted tones. Chelsea said they matched the new color palette. I found the photos stacked in a cardboard box in the garage. Even the kitchen wasn't spared. The floral curtains I'd sewn myself were swapped out for white blinds. My favorite tea kettle disappeared, replaced with a chrome contraption I could never figure out. Every change was explained as helping to freshen up the place, but each one chipped away at the home I knew. I tried to tell myself it was fine. I still had my bedroom, the garden, my morning walks to the pier. But then came the day I overheard them in the living room. I was in the hallway carrying laundry to the dryer when Ethan's voice drifted through the half-open door. "If we sell it now, the market's perfect," he was saying. Chelsea's reply was hushed but sharp. "We just have to convince her it's too much for her to handle. Once she's out, we can list it and start looking at properties closer to my parents." I froze in place, my hands gripping the laundry basket so tight my knuckles hurt. They were talking about my home, my only home, like it was just an asset waiting to be cashed in. That night at dinner, I watched them. Chelsea chatted about a stunning mid-century place she'd seen online. Ethan nodded along his fork, moving absently through his food. I didn't say a word. Weeks later, it was Emily who let the truth slip in the gentlest way possible. She was sitting on the porch swing with me, her legs tucked under her, scrolling through something on her phone. "Dad says when we move to the new house, I can have my own bathroom," she said casually, not looking up. I kept my voice calm. New house. She blinked, realizing she'd said too much. "Oh, I mean, they've just been talking about maybe selling this one. To, get something different." Different how I asked. Emily's eyes darted toward the screen. "I don't know. They just said it'd be better for everyone. Dad said something about using the money to invest in. I think he said a partnership with Uncle Matt." The breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced a smile. "I see. Well, thank you for telling me, sweetheart." She shrugged, oblivious to the storm her words had stirred inside me, and went back to her phone. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, staring out at the yard. 50 years of memories in this house. Birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings with coffee. And they were making plans to erase it all. I didn't sleep much that night. I walked the halls, touching the doorframes, the banister, the worn edge of the kitchen counter where John used to lean while telling me about his day. Each creak of the floorboards seemed to ask the same question: how much longer will you be here? By morning, I had decided not to confront them. At least not yet. The shock had cooled into something steadier, a low ember of resolve. If they thought I would just hand over my life's work without a fight, they didn't know me as well as they thought. I poured myself a cup of coffee and looked out at the garden. The roses were just beginning to bloom. Somewhere deep down, I knew they might be blooming here for the last time under my care. But I also knew I wasn't going to let Ethan and Chelsea be the ones to decide when that happened. By the following afternoon, I was walking across the street to Helen's house. Her porch smelled faintly of lemon balm, and she waved me in before I'd even knocked twice. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said, leading me toward the kitchen. Helen and I had been neighbors for over 30 years, and she could read me better than most. I sat down at her oak table, the same one we'd played cards at countless times, and told her everything. Ethan and Chelsea's suggestion that I find a place more suitable for my age, the changes they'd made to the house, Emily's slip about selling. Helen listened without interrupting, her sharp blue eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, she set her coffee mug down with a thud. "That's not just disrespectful, Margaret. That's them deciding your life for you." I let out a slow breath. I don't even know what I can do. The house is in my name, but they act like it's already theirs. "It's not," she said firmly. "And I know someone who can make sure you remember that." She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Lucas Grant. Remember him?" He was a couple of years ahead of us in high school. Went on to become a real estate attorney in town. I hadn't thought about Lucas in decades, but I remembered his easy smile and steady way of talking. "You think he could help?" "I think he can tell you exactly where you stand. And if there's a way to turn the tables, he'll find it." By the next morning, I was sitting in Lucas's office, the kind of place that smelled faintly of leather and old paper. He greeted me with that same easy smile I remembered, though his hair had gone silver at the temples. "What brings you in, Margaret?" he asked as we sat down across from each other. I pulled a worn folder from my bag. "I'm not sure how much you need to see, but these are the deed papers from when John and I put the house into a trust." Lucas slipped on a pair of reading glasses and began to flip through the documents. He took his time tapping the pages with his pen now and then. I sat quietly, hands clasped in my lap, watching his expression. Finally, he looked up. "This is a life estate trust. You're listed as the trustee, Margaret. That means you retain the right to live in the house for as long as you wish, and this is the important part. You also have the right to sell it if you choose." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through my thoughts. So, they can't make me leave, but I can make them leave. His mouth curved in a knowing smile. "If you wanted to sell, yes. The property's yours to dispose of as you see fit. Their names aren't on the deed. Any improvements they've made are just gifts to the property." I thought of the glass dining table, the blinds, the new rug. None of it mattered legally. All those quiet weeks of feeling cornered. Suddenly the walls didn't feel so close. Lucas leaned forward. "If you're thinking about selling, I'd suggest keeping that decision to yourself until everything's in place. Discretion will give you the upper hand. I don't even know where I'd go." I admitted, though, a flicker of an old dream. Whitewashed walls and blue domes against the sea passed through my mind. "You'll figure that part out," he said. "For now, let's focus on the legal side. I'll make a few calls, connect you with a realtor I trust. And Margaret, don't sign anything they hand you without letting me see it first." I nodded, feeling a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. "Thank you, Lucas. Really." Walking back home, the air felt different. The roses along the path seemed brighter, the breeze lighter. For the first time since Ethan's words on the porch, I felt the weight in my chest ease just enough to take a full breath. Inside the house was quiet. I passed the living room where Chelsea's new rug lay perfectly centered, and the kitchen with its chrome kettle gleaming on the stove. None of it mattered now. They thought they had control, but they didn't know I held the only set of keys that truly counted. I stood by the window looking out at the garden. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Helen's laugh drifting across the street. In my bag, the folder with the trust documents felt heavier than it should, but this time it was the kind of weight I wanted to carry. I didn't know exactly what my next step would be, but I knew this much. I wasn't going to wait for Ethan and Chelsea to decide my fate, and when the time came, they wouldn't see it coming. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the only sound in the house. Every word Ethan and Chelsea had said over the past few weeks played on a loop in my mind, growing sharper each time I heard them. My hands ached from clenching the sheets, my chest tight with a mix of anger and hurt I couldn't shake. Around 2 a.m, I gave up on trying to rest. I reached over, switched on the lamp, and let the soft glow spill across the room. My eyes drifted to the bookshelf in the corner. Rows of albums, framed photographs, and the wooden box John had made me for our 10th anniversary. I got up and opened it. Inside were the little treasures of our life, the ticket stubs from the state fair where he won me a stuffed bear, a napkin with his handwriting from the day he asked me to marry him, the small seashell we found on our honeymoon in Carmel. I traced my fingers over the shell, remembering how he'd told me it looked like it had been shaped by 100 years of waves, just like love is shaped over time. That memory caught in my throat. I wandered through the house barefoot, touching the walls as I went, pausing at the hallway where Ethan's school pictures once hung. The outlines where the frames used to be were faint but still visible. In the living room, I sat on the couch and pulled an old photo album from the coffee table drawer. Page after page, I saw my life in this house. Birthday cakes with too many candles. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper piled high, John grilling in the backyard. By the time I closed the album, the air felt different around me. A thought that had been hovering at the edges of my mind for days stepped fully into view. I couldn't keep living here like this, not with every corner reminding me of the slow, quiet erasure of my life by people who were supposed to protect it. I went into the study and turned on the computer. The screen's blue light filled the room as I opened a browser and typed, "Best places to retire by the ocean." Dozens of lists appeared. Florida, Maine, Hawaii. But one word stopped me cold: Santorini. I clicked the link and was greeted by images of whitewashed buildings clinging to cliffs, blue domes shining under the sun, and that impossibly deep blue water of the Aegean Sea. It pulled at something deep in my chest. John and I had once talked about Santorini on a rainy afternoon, both of us curled up in the living room with mugs of tea. He'd read an article about the sunsets in Oya, said they were the kind of sunsets you carry with you for the rest of your life. We promised each other that one day we'd stand there together and watch the sky burn gold over the water. We never got the chance. Life work and raising Ethan had filled the years, and then John was gone. But as I stared at those photographs on the screen, I felt him close again, as if he were saying, "It's not too late, Maggie." I leaned back in the chair and imagined waking up to that view every morning, walking down cobblestone streets to buy bread from a bakery, learning a few words of Greek, feeling the sea breeze, instead of the tension that seemed to hang in the air here. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, the decision had taken root. I wasn't going to wait for Ethan and Chelsea to push me out. I was going to walk out on my own terms. And I wasn't just leaving. I was going somewhere they would never expect. I closed the laptop and went back to my bedroom. The house was still quiet, but I heard the faint rustle of leaves outside and the first call of a mourning dove. It struck me that this might be one of the last mornings I'd wake up here. The idea didn't make me sad. It made me feel lighter, as if a locked door in my mind had swung open and I could finally see the path ahead. 2 days later, I was back in Lucas's office, a folder of trust documents between us. He listened carefully as I explained my decision, his expression shifting from thoughtful to quietly impressed. "If you're ready to move forward," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I have just the person for you. Discreet, fast, and very good at her job. She'll have this place under contract before Ethan and Chelsea even know what's happening." He picked up the phone and dialed. "Rachel, it's Lucas. I've got a special client who needs a listing handled with the utmost confidentiality." By the next morning, I was sitting across from Rachel Meyer at my kitchen table. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, no-nonsense demeanor. She'd clearly sold enough homes to know when a client needed more than just a sign in the yard. "We'll keep this off the public radar as long as possible," she assured me, flipping open her laptop. "Professional photos, private showings only, and all offers sent directly to me and Lucas. We'll set the price strategically. High enough to attract serious buyers, not so high it scares them off. How does $25 million sound for the listing? It was more than I'd dared to hope for. Let's do it. She spent the next hour walking through the house with a discreet photographer, noting details and asking about upgrades. I stayed close, making sure Ethan and Chelsea didn't come home early from work. By the end of the day, the listing was ready to go live. Just not in any way my son or his wife would stumble across it. The first offer came in within 48 hours, then another, and then a third, this one from a man named Robert Hayes who had grown up in Santa Barbara and wanted a home where he could retire. Rachel's eyes lit up when she saw his terms: $2. $35 million, no contingencies, 14-day closing. He's solid, she told me. He's not looking to gut the place, wants to keep the garden as it is. That last part sealed it for me. I thought of my roses, the trellis John built, the shaded corner where Emily used to play. I'll take Robert's offer. Once the contract was signed, I felt a rush of adrenaline and fear all at once. The countdown had begun. 14 days to pack up a lifetime without tipping off the 2 people living under my roof. I called Helen as soon as Rachel left. "It's happening," I whispered into the phone. "That's my girl," she said. "You need help packing. I can't risk too many boxes showing up all at once, but I'll start with the things they won't notice missing." That night, I opened the cedar chest in my bedroom and began wrapping framed photographs in old towels. I packed the porcelain tea set my mother had given me, John's fishing rod, the quilt my grandmother made. Each item went into a plain cardboard box with nothing on the outside to suggest what was inside. Lucas had given me the name of a shipping company that specialized in international moves. I called them the next morning. The man on the line quoted me $18,000 to have my belongings picked up, crated, shipped, and stored in a secure warehouse in Athens until I was ready for them in Santorini. Worth every penny, I told him. No one here can know until it's done. He promised the crew could work quickly and quietly. We set the pickup date for the day after closing. In the meantime, I began moving smaller boxes into Helen's garage under the guise of clearing out old clutter. She didn't ask questions, just cleared a space in the back and draped a tarp over the growing pile. Inside the house, Ethan and Chelsea were blissfully unaware. Chelsea was busy texting her designer about the open concept vision, and Ethan seemed focused on a new investment project. I kept my voice even when they spoke to me, nodding and smiling as though nothing in the world was different. At night, though, I lay in bed, feeling the weight of the secret between us. I had started something I couldn't turn back from, and for the first time in months, that thought didn't scare me. It made me feel alive. From the outside, nothing in the house looked different. I still made coffee in the mornings, still clipped roses from the garden to put on the kitchen table. Still asked Ethan about his work, and Chelsea about Emily's school projects. But under the surface, every interaction felt like walking a tightrope. Chelsea was in her element that week. I caught her at the dining table one morning, laptop open, scrolling through swatches of paint colors and floor plans. She was on the phone with someone named Tina from a design firm in town, saying, "Yes, we can definitely start demolition by the end of the month. Once the place is empty." Her voice was bright, like she was planning a surprise party, not talking about tearing apart my home. Emily, sweet girl, did her best to keep my secret. But she wasn't good at hiding the flicker in her eyes every time her parents talked about the big plans. One afternoon, she lingered in the kitchen while Chelsea was in the other room, whispering, "Are you sure they won't find out, Grandma?" I squeezed her hand and whispered back, "Not until I'm ready." The tension climbed another notch when Ethan came into the living room one evening, holding a manila envelope. "Mom, I need you to sign a couple of things," he said casually. I set down my tea and took the papers. The first was a transfer of utility services form. Electricity, water, internet. All to be switched into his name. "What's this for?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "So we can start making the upgrades without any interruptions," he said. "It'll be simpler if the bills come to me. You won't have to worry about a thing." I flipped through the pages, slowly buying time, my mind turning over the implications. It was bold, too bold. He wasn't just planning for me to leave. He was positioning himself to take full control before I was even gone. "I'll look these over tomorrow," I said, handing them back. He looked a little annoyed, but shrugged. "Sure, just don't wait too long. We've got a schedule." As soon as he left the room, I took out my phone and snapped photos of every page. Later, I forwarded them to Lucas with a short message. "Proof of intent. Keep for the file." I began moving more of my belongings into boxes after that, but in a way that wouldn't draw attention. I took down the porcelain figurines from the mantel, leaving a couple of Chelsea's generic candles in their place. I emptied drawers in the guest room, telling Chelsea I was donating old linens. She barely looked up from her phone. Every so often, Chelsea would float in with a tape measure or a notepad, talking about where the light fixture will go, or how open the kitchen will feel without this wall. I smiled and nodded, never giving her reason to suspect that in less than 2 weeks, none of it would matter. Evenings were the hardest. I'd sit in my room hearing the low murmur of Ethan and Chelsea's voices downstairs, and imagine what they thought the next month would look like. They saw themselves as the new owners, the decision-makers. I let them live in that illusion a little longer because every day they believed it. My advantage grew. One night as I was folding clothes into a box, I found the small travel journal John had given me for my birthday years ago. The first page had only one line in his handwriting for the places we'll see together. I traced the ink with my fingertip and slipped it into my purse. That was one thing I'd carry with me until the end. By the time the weekend rolled around, the house felt almost like a stage set. Chelsea kept talking about contractors, and Ethan was drawing up budget projections at the kitchen counter. I kept my head down, careful not to disturb their script. Inside, though, I knew the real performance would be mine, and the final act was already in motion. 3 days before closing, an email popped into my inbox from the electric company. The subject line made my pulse jump: service termination notice. The date matched exactly with the day Robert Hayes would get the keys. I stared at the screen for a moment, a strange mix of satisfaction and tension twisting in my chest. I forwarded it to Lucas with the note, "Everything's aligning. See you at closing." That afternoon, Helen came over in her gardening hat, pretending to bring me a jar of her homemade fig jam. Once the front door was shut, she looked around and whispered, "All right, let's finish the last of it." We worked quickly, carrying boxes of framed photographs, John's fishing gear, and my grandmother's quilts out to her SUV. Helen tucked them under a blanket in the back, out of sight. Each trip up and down the stairs felt like a small victory. By early evening, the rooms upstairs were stripped of anything that mattered to me. The bedspread was plain, the walls bare. If Ethan or Chelsea came snooping, they'd just think I'd decluttered. I was wiping down the nightstand when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Chelsea appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. "Where's the cedar chest that was at the foot of your bed?" she asked, her tone light but her gaze sharp. I didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I moved it into storage. Just rearranging a bit." Her eyebrows arched. "And the hutch in the guest room?" "The one with all the china packed up for safekeeping," I said, turning back to fold the last of the sheets. "Didn't want it in the way with all your remodeling plans." There was a flicker in her eyes. Suspicion. But she forced a smile. "Right. Makes sense. Just don't overdo it, okay? We don't want you exhausting yourself before the move." I gave her a small smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'll be fine." She lingered a second longer, then stepped back into the hallway. I could hear her heels clicking down the stairs, the sound carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. Later, while she and Ethan were in the living room, I passed by on my way to the kitchen. Chelsea's voice was low, almost a hiss. "I'm telling you, she's moving stuff out. We need to be careful." Ethan mumbled something I couldn't make out, but his tone was dismissive. That was fine by me. Let him think I was just clearing clutter. By the time I reached the kitchen, Lucas had texted, "All paperwork is in order. You just need to sign at closing. Robert is eager to move in on schedule." I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the weight of the secret settle back into my bones. Every step now had to be measured. In less than a week, this house would no longer be mine, and Ethan and Chelsea would find themselves standing in a reality they never planned for. That night, I packed one final box in my closet, sealing it with tape. I slid it under the bed, hidden in plain sight. The house was still theirs to look at, but mine to control. For just a few more days. The morning of January 31st was crisp and bright, the kind of winter day in Santa Barbara that fools you into thinking spring is just around the corner. I was up before sunrise, moving quietly through the house, my suitcase already packed and standing by the front door. On the kitchen table sat a single ivory envelope. Inside was a letter I had written by hand, each word measured deliberate. Beneath it, I'd tucked a photocopy of the signed purchase agreement with Robert Hayes, the closing date circled in red. 14 days. That was all the time they had left in this house. I poured myself one last cup of coffee and stood by the window looking out at the garden. The roses were just starting to push out new buds. For a moment, I let myself feel the ache of what I was leaving, but only for a moment. Then I set the mug in the sink and waited. It was nearly 9 when I heard Ethan's car pull into the driveway. Chelsea's heels clicked against the tile a moment later as they came in, still talking about some contractor meeting scheduled for next week. Ethan reached for the envelope without thinking, tearing it open as he walked toward the counter. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines, then stop, his brow furrowed. Chelsea, curious, leaned over his shoulder. Her voice was sharp when she spoke. "What is this supposed to mean?" Ethan read aloud the part about the sale being finalized, the date of possession, the name of the new owner. His voice faltered on the last words. Chelsea snatched the paper from him, flipping to the contract. "This says, the house is sold. 14 days. Are you out of your mind?" I stepped forward, my voice calm. "You told me to find a place more suitable for my age." "I did." Ethan turned toward me, pale. "Mom, why didn't you say anything? I didn't think it was necessary." I said, "You've both made it very clear you had other plans for this house. Now it's no longer your concern." Chelsea's face flushed a deep red. "You can't just..." I cut in my tone even but final. "It's already done. The buyer will be here in 2 weeks. I've made my arrangements." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in months, I saw something that looked almost like uncertainty in his eyes. Chelsea, on the other hand, looked like she might explode. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" she demanded. I picked up the handle of my suitcase. "Yes, I've taken control of my life. You might try it sometime." Neither of them moved as I rolled the suitcase toward the door. I paused long enough to glance back at the table, the papers spread between them like a wound they didn't know how to dress. Outside, the air felt fresher than it had in years. The taxi was waiting at the curb, engine idling. The driver stepped out to load my bags into the trunk. I didn't look back. The flight from Los Angeles to Athens felt like a bridge between 2 lives. I spent most of it staring out the window, watching the night sky give way to dawn over the Atlantic, thinking of John and that long-ago promise about Santorini. When the plane finally touched down in Athens, the air that hit me as I stepped outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of the sea. I had a short layover before catching the flight to Santorini. The view as we descended into the island nearly took my breath away. Whitewashed buildings clinging to cliffs, the caldera opening wide to the blue Aegean like an embrace. A driver was waiting at the small airport holding a sign with my name. "Welcome to Santorini, Mrs. Cole," he said warmly, loading my suitcase into the van. We wound through narrow roads lined with stone walls and bursts of bougainvillea until we reached Oya. The apartment I'd rented was perched right over the caldera, its small terrace framed by a cobalt blue railing. I stepped inside and opened the doors wide, letting the salty breeze pour in. Below, the water shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and somewhere nearby I could hear the faint clinking of dishes from a cafe. For the first few days, I let myself wander. I explored the open-air market in Fira, buying ripe tomatoes, glossy eggplants, and a loaf of still-warm bread from a baker who pressed it into my hands with a smile. I signed up for a beginner's Greek class at a small language school. Kalimera for good morning, Efcharisto for thank you. My accent was terrible, but the teacher said it would come. One evening I joined a local cooking class. We learned to make moussaka layering eggplant-spiced lamb and creamy bechamel. The instructor winked as she handed me my plate, saying, "Eat this, and you'll never want to leave." But life has always had its small tests. A week after I arrived, I got an email from the shipping company. My belongings were still in Athens, held up at the port of Piraeus due to customs delays. The message was polite but vague. Processing could take several more weeks. I stared at the screen, then looked around my mostly empty apartment. Aside from a few clothes, a rented bed, and a chipped ceramic mug from the corner store, I had almost nothing. For a moment, I felt that old panic rising, the instinct to fix things immediately to make the space feel like home. But then I took a breath and decided I could manage. I bought a set of simple dishes from a shop down the street, picked up a blanket from the market, and learned how to get by with just what I had. In the evenings, I'd sit on the terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun sink low until the sky burned gold and pink over the caldera. The apartment was bare, yes, but the view made up for every missing piece of furniture. After years of feeling crowded in my own home, there was something freeing about living with so little. I could hear the sea at night, and in the mornings the sound of footsteps on the cobblestone below. My things would arrive when they arrived. For now, I had what I needed. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. It was a warm afternoon in April when my phone buzzed on the small table beside me. The number flashing on the screen made my breath catch for a second. Ethan. I hadn't heard his voice since the day I left Santa Barbara. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of him exhaling. "Mom, it's me." His voice was thinner than I remembered, tired around the edges. "I know," I said softly. "How are you?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not great. Chelsea, she left, packed her things 2 weeks ago, said she wasn't going to stick around if there wasn't a house in the deal." I stayed quiet, letting the words hang. "She found someplace closer to her parents," he continued. "I'm in a 1-bedroom apartment now. It's not much. I had to let go of the renovation crew I hired, lost a big contract at work because I couldn't cover both ends. I've been doing overtime just to keep up." I could hear the weight in his voice, the kind that doesn't come from just a bad month, but from realizing the ground under your feet isn't as solid as you thought. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said after a long pause. "For everything, for how we treated you. I thought I was doing what was best for us, but I see now it was selfish. I should have respected you, your home, your life." I leaned against the railing of my terrace, looking out at the sun hitting the white walls of Oya. "Ethan, I appreciate your apology, but respect isn't something you show only when it's convenient. It has to be there alongside love, or it's not worth much." "I know," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about that a lot. I'd like to come visit you, if you'll let me. I don't want things to stay the way they are between us." I let the sound of the waves fill the space between us before I answered. "You can come, but understand, Ipoyan. If we're going to have a relationship again, it has to be built on both respect and love. One can't survive without the other." There was a hint of relief in his voice. "I understand. Thank you, Mom." After we hung up, I stood there for a while, the phone still in my hand. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the smallest shift, a loosening of the knot I'd carried since the day I left. The hurt wasn't gone, but just maybe there was room for something better to grow in its place. When Ethan stepped out of the small arrivals hall at Santorini's airport, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked leaner, older somehow, his shoulders carrying a different kind of weight. But when he saw me, he smiled, tentatively, like he wasn't sure if it was welcome. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the road winding past fields of grapevines and whitewashed chapels. Finally, he said, "This place is beautiful. I can see why you came." That evening we walked along the narrow paths in Oya, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the caldera. The light painted everything in gold, and the sea breeze lifted strands of my hair. Ethan kept pace beside me, hands in his pockets, glancing around like he wanted to memorize every detail. Over dinner at a small taverna by the water, he told me about the past few months. How the apartment felt too quiet after Chelsea left, how the overtime hours kept him from seeing Emily as much as he wanted, how he'd started cooking for himself again, because takeout wasn't in the budget. I didn't realize how much I leaned on the idea of having things handed to me, he admitted, swirling the wine in his glass. Losing the house. It forced me to face a lot about myself. I listened, watching the way the candlelight flickered against his face. There was no defensiveness now, none of the sharp edges I'd seen before. Just a man who had been humbled and was trying in his own way to rebuild. At one point, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped parcel. "Robert, your buyer sent me this," he said. "It was in the attic behind some boxes. I thought you should have it, but I was wondering if you'd let me keep it instead." I unfolded the paper to find a framed photograph. John, a much younger Ethan and me, standing in the backyard one summer afternoon, all of us grinning like the world was perfect. My chest tightened. I looked up at him. "Why do you want it?" He met my gaze, because I need a reminder of what mattered before I started chasing things that didn't. I held the picture for a moment longer, then slid it back toward him. "Keep it. Just promise me you'll remember what that day felt like every time you see it." "I will," he said quietly. We finished our meal in a comfortable silence, the waves lapping just beyond the patio. Later, as we walked back toward my apartment, I knew I wasn't ready to promise a return to Santa Barbara. But I also knew that whatever happened next, the line between us wasn't as wide as it had been. We could keep talking, keep trying. And for now, that was enough. A week after Ethan flew back to California, I found an envelope waiting in my mailbox downstairs. The return address was Robert Hayes. Inside was a short note written in neat, slanted handwriting. "Dear Margaret, I thought you might like to see this. The roses are in full bloom. I've done my best to care for them, just as you would have. Your home is loved here." Warmly, Robert tucked behind the note was a photograph. The garden was awash with color, pink, red, and white blossoms spilling over the trellis John had built so many years ago. The morning light cast soft shadows across the lawn, and for a moment I could almost smell the roses through the paper. I set the photo on the table, letting my fingers rest against the edge of the frame. There was a strange comfort in knowing the place I had poured 50 years of my life into wasn't just a property on paper anymore. It was still alive, still tended, still holding pieces of me in its soil. That evening I carried the picture out to the terrace. The sun was melting into the Aegean, the horizon a deep band of gold and violet. The air was warm, carrying the briny scent of the sea, and somewhere down in the square I could hear the faint notes of a bouzouki. I leaned against the railing, letting the wind brush against my face. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found my place. Not just a home, but a belonging, a life shaped on my terms, far from the voices that once tried to shrink it. I thought about the long road that had brought me here, the quiet sacrifices, the betrayals, the nights lying awake wondering if I had the courage to choose myself. And I realized something important. Home isn't just where you live. It's the space you create for yourself when you stop waiting for permission. To anyone listening, I'd say this: never let someone else decide your worth or your place in the world. Be the one holding the wheel of your own life, no matter how long it takes to get your hands on it. If you've been moved by this story, I invite you to stay with me for more journeys. Tales of love loss and the quiet strength that changes everything. Your own next chapter might be closer than you think.